Our first speaker today is Rui Kaneya. He is a senior reporter at the Center for Public Integrity. Before joining CPI, he was an investigative reporter for the Honolulu Civil Beat, covering criminal justice, immigration, and other social justice issues. And he is the leader, author, builder of the Copy-Paste Legislate series, which he's going to be talking about today, which is kind of like the prime resource for people looking at model legislation. That project won the Goldsmith Award, or the Goldsmith Prize, among other prizes last year. So we're thrilled to have Rui come to talk about, to show you the work, to talk about it, to take your questions, and to show how you can use the database that they built in your own State House coverage. So Rui, thanks much for coming, and I'll turn the floor over to you. We have Rui till 11:50, so he's going to talk and then take questions.
Thank you, Chris. I have a bunch of things to go through, but please interrupt me anytime because I have 15 minutes to fill. So any questions you guys have about any of that stuff that I talk about, that would be great at any point. And I'm going to be dropping lots of links to the chat. So let's start with that. But again, thanks for having me. Apologies for not actually shaving for the occasion. I am heading to the Capitol Hill later today to renew my press pass, and wanted to take the picture, the pandemic version of myself for the occasion. I have a pandemic ponytail too. I haven't had a haircut in a year or so. Anyway,
your beard looks kind of trimmed. I mean, I guess maybe
not really. No.
Okay. All right.
Anyway, so all right. So I've been at the CPI for about a little over 3 years now, and this was the first project I took on, and ending up taking 2 years to from start to finish. So that was quite an undertaking, but I think it came out relatively well. The entire premise of the whole thing was that throughout the history of the CPI, and we've been around, I guess it's about 30 years, and many stories that we've done in the past ending up talking about some kind of model legislation. And when we do kind of a watchdog type of stories, then always you will find those pieces. And but we were just finding those things in a piecemeal, and wanted to see if there's a way that we can actually come up with to really just systematically identify these bills and see if we can actually write a story and whole package on that. So that's sort of the premise of it. Just to be on the same page with everybody, so my understanding and our understanding of sort of the model bills and kind of stuff we wanted to look for were the kind of document that the special interest groups will put together on their own. And instead of doing the traditional lobbying in the legislature, they would basically have the lobbyist meet with the lawmaker and hand this particular piece of paper and say, hey, we've done some work for you, so you don't have to. And if you can just introduce it for us, and that would be great. And oftentimes that happens, right? Many of these legislative, the lawmakers, they're part-timers, they have side jobs, they don't have a lot of staff to deal with. So if they want to introduce their own bills, they have to do their own research, and they have to write it up. And if they are pressed on time, they just can't put together those things. So if somebody else comes in and says, hey, here's the thing that I've done for you, and about the subject that is that you have sympathies for, okay, we're just going to copy and paste into this bill form, and I'm just going to introduce it as if it's something that I've written. So that's sort of the typical example of what happens behind the scenes, right? So that's kind of the stuff we wanted to look for. Does that really jive with what everybody understands the model bills to be, more or less? But if you have some other understanding too, love to talk about that as well. But as I said, that what I just described is sort of stereotypical way of model bills gets introduced. Oftentimes, you know, the entire content of the bill or of the model bill won't get copied and pasted because most of the time, you know, if you're dealing with certain kind of regulation, say, you know, car, I'm going to talk about this later, the car recall and, you know, the regulations around that, says typically there's some kind of bill or some kind of statute already in your state's books, right? And what usually happens is that you introduce a bill to either insert a certain section of what you want to introduce into what's already in the statute, or you know, replace the cross out certain section from that existing bill, and you introduce a new thing into it. So what you end up having is a you know, 90% already been written, and you know what's already what's really interesting and what you should pay attention to is the 10% of the content. So it's really tricky sometimes what you're looking for, and especially when you want to build a system to really identify what's model bill or not. And I'm going to get into a little bit more of that because that was a pain in the butt for our standpoint. But anyway, so that's that. So I'm not sure how many of you had seen this particular story this week. This is a piece by New York Times that talks about model bills on border restrictions, right? It's basically, you know, I know yesterday that Georgia signed into law the bill on restricting the voters' rights. There's a whole bunch of other that's pending in pretty much all the other states too. And many of them happen to be actually based on model bills. And it doesn't take a genius to really figure out that is the case. And in many of the hot button issues, you know, dealing with abortion or things like that, you know, there's already a whole bunch of model bills out there. Tricky part is like, if you are actually dealing with some other relatively obscure topic, and whether you can identify those bills as model bills, that's much trickier. So hopefully that will be something that you can actually use our tracker for, although there's some challenges in doing that as well. So anyway, so there's actually, you guys know this too. Alec, you guys know who they are? So they have model registration and they're pretty notorious for it. So that's probably why you know them to begin with. And they actually, they used to keep them secret, but they actually have everything online nowadays. So you can actually look up what they're actually trying to push for. So it's just a matter of, you know, kind of looking at their content and see if you can actually spot anything in your state. So that's kind of cool. And that's essentially what one of the two databases that we built, or two tools that we actually built for this project is actually doing. So going back a little bit, so we started back in 2018 to get on this project. At the time we were working on our own, but eventually having a partnership with USA Today folks and the folks at the Arizona Republic, we were actually working on the same project basically without knowing what was going on. We were almost done at the beginning of 2019, and we were ready to publish some of the stories. And we happened to go, because we are a nonprofit investigative outlet. We usually partner with other publications to publish our stories too. So we just happened to go to USA Today folks and say, hey, you guys interested in partnering with a particular project we've been working on for about a year? And they were like, oh, hey, we should talk, because they were already exactly working on the same thing. But they were quite a bit behind than we were. So, like they obviously didn't want us to kind of publish our stuff and kind of get scooped on it. So we ended up deciding to partner and actually put all the resources together to see what we can come up with. And it was kind of awkward at the beginning, but at the end, I think everything came out well. Anyway, so they were building their own tracker, which I don't think they have available to the public. And we were building a totally different one. And we were making that public. And so their version of it, as my understanding of it, is that they basically put together and gathered all of the model legislation that you can actually gather from places like ALEC, and see if they can actually feed each one of them into the to the database. And with each one, let's see if they can actually compare to every single bill that has been ever introduced since 2010, and see if you can actually find any match. And the result of it is this thing. So this is the read piece that they worked on. And the finding was basically, hey, after running all these things and fed hundreds of known model bills into the database, they were able to find 10,000 or more than 10,000 model bills that have been introduced during an 8-year period, 2010 to 2018. And that's pretty conservative estimate, because as I just talked about, like this is basically a subset of all the model bills out there, because you are just looking for known model bills that we can gather, but ignoring what we don't know. So there should be a whole bunch of model bills that's not counted in this 10,000 number. So that's where we come in. We couldn't, for the reasons I'm going to explain a little bit more in detail later, we can't quite say definitively the way that USA Today were able to, in terms of how many model bills out there, but my total guesstimate is somewhere along, at least 2 or 3 times more, maybe even 10 times more, if you count the good chunk of, I'll get into that later, but we can't really say that for sure. But there's a whole bunch of bills that have big chunk of their text that are almost identical in many other states. And if you start counting those, then you will find tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of them out of the more than 1 million or so bills that have been introduced during that time. Let me just give you this text here of all the stories we published under this project. It's right there. So I can't take credit for any of the behind the scenes programming part of it. I didn't do any of that. That's way beyond me. We had a super talented guy on our data team who basically spent days and weeks and months just coding and coding from morning to night to build what I'm going to show you a little bit later. So my job was basically using the preliminary version of what he was building and start identifying good examples to cite to show to the people that, why you should care. It's like, here are the egregious examples of model legislation that you don't know about, but this is pretty much how it goes in your state. So I just shared another story there. I wrote this piece that had to do with used car dealers and the fact that they can actually sell cars with recalls on them, really, really bad recalls on them without even, with only a little notice, maybe, you know, a page out of dozens of documents that you receive at the end of your purchase, right? And that was because of this particular model bill. Anyway, what we wanted to do basically was find a model bill written by this particular, any special interest groups who are trying to make some buck, even though, you know, by doing so, it might hurt somebody. And wanted to avoid certain stories that that well known, like any ALEC bill, for example. I wouldn't want to be an example because people already know about ALEC. You know, you can easily find those bills. So things that no one has ever written yet. So I went through something like 10,000 bills that were identified in the tracker. It was a pain, but many of them I can just scroll through, you know, within a few seconds, and went through probably more than 100 bills and actually read them and see they were actually doing what I thought they were doing. So, you know, it's sometimes you just have to read the piece of legislation to actually understand what the intent of it behind it. It's like really, and even if you read it once or twice, sometimes you don't even realize how bad it is sometimes. This was actually a pretty good example because I happen to know somebody in the car consumer market who were an advocate for consumer safety. So when I talked to her about certain bills I was reading, you know, she flagged it, like that's something that she's been fighting in many different states. It looks like from the look of it, it looks like this is a very good bill, consumer protection bill. That's how they were actually buying support for this bill, right? So basically, the idea was, you know, remember those Takata airbags and a GM ignition switch failure that was happening and people dying out of that? So those things are happening, and there's so many recalled cars out there in the used car market. And, you know, from the standpoint of used car dealers, you basically, like, you were stuck. You couldn't sell them. If you require them to actually repair those defects before you are allowed to sell, then you're basically stuck with those cars for many months, because some of them aren't, you know, they don't even have the repair solutions for them. So they wanted to get rid of them, but they were also afraid of getting sued later when somebody gets in a car, get into an accident, and, you know, end up in hospitals or whatever, or getting killed, right? So they wanted to get some kind of legal protection somehow. So they came up with this particular rule that says, okay, if you are going to sell any of those vehicles with recalls on them, you definitely have to disclose that. And that's where the sort of the consumer protection aspect of it comes from. But if, you know, the bill says nothing about the fact that you actually have to repair these cars, you know, and it says nothing about that. It gives you the legal protection, but in practice it does, because basically if you get sued later, you can go to the court and say, hey, you know, we did everything that we were required to do under this particular statute. You know, we disclosed it, and now it's up in the hands of the consumer who bought it with the knowledge that there is a recall. And that's pretty effective, right? So they knew that. But unless, like, you actually understand the entire tactic behind this, you know, you never realize it. So that was really, really clever way of actually sneaking in this particular model bills. And so anyway, I wrote that story as a lead piece for our project. And we end up having something along maybe about 10 stories in total, something close, something along the line of, well, my story was basically about the special interest groups making money out of these things. But we also went to other stories that is more ideology based. There's one about the Palestinian-Israel conflict thing that was happening in the statehouses, which is really, really weird, but that's super interesting. I also wrote about abortion bills, not the ones that you usually hear, the anti-abortion bills. That's already, written hundreds of times. But I wrote the new wave of bills that is on the other side. Women's rights groups were starting to copy that strategy, and they were actually writing model bills to counter all the bills that's gets introduced every year. They were like, we can't just be on the defensive about these things. We should be, actually proactive, because sooner or later they were afraid that the Supreme Court is going to take the road down. So things like that. So we were actually be able to find many good examples of these things, and we probably could have kept going and keep writing these stories, except we are starting to get a little bored, so we moved on. Let's see, any questions so far of what I'm talking about?
Yeah, well, we'll go to Stella in a second. I just one real quick question. Are you sharing or trying to share your screen right now, or are you just giving us the links in?
Yeah, just the links for the moment.
Okay, all right, just want to make sure. All right, so Stella, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. This is fascinating, and model legislation has always been like one of the priorities that I wanted to do. So I, a while back, I wrote a story about how transgender athlete bill is advancing in at least 21 states, and that to count through that, I basically like manually searched for language and compared it to an Idaho bill that was passed last year. It was the only state at the time to pass that bill. So like it took like 2 days for me to like compare side by side. And it's very time consuming. And I also don't know if it's like comprehensive at all. And so I was wondering like apart from coding, because obviously our newsroom doesn't really have on its own, doesn't really have that data team. So is there anything else that we can do, apart from the coding, to identify, okay, this might be a model bill and this might be of interest to us? Do you have any tips?
Yes.
Just FYI, Stella's from the Nashville, Tennessean, so always mention your publication.
Right. Sorry about that.
That used car legislation, actually, the Tennessee was one of the 2 states actually that passed it. So that was totally interesting. And to answer your questions, it's actually a very good segue to showing you the tracker, which hopefully will help you in what you're trying to do. So let me see. Here is the link, and I'm going to share my screen. So this is the thing that we built. So this is one of the 2 tools that we built. One is, again, not public, that's owned by USA Today, and we don't even have access. I saw on the list of fellows here, some of you actually work for USA Today, so you might be having access. I don't know what the policy is within the newsrooms, but, and this is the other one that we built. And the philosophy behind this particular tool is a little bit different from what I described for the USA Today version of it. We wanted to basically be able to take any bills that you're interested in that have been introduced since 2010 and be able to basically compare it to every other bill that have been introduced in the same period, and see if we can actually spot any bills that share a big chunk of the text. So here's the one version, one way to look for it. So this is sort of a recent one, just to get a sense of what kind of stuff are out there. So past year, unfortunately, by the way, this tool has not been updated for the past 4 months or so. We are about to do the reset. I was actually talking to the data guy before this, and he was hoping to do this by today, but there's just way too many bills to actually scan. So it takes a little while. So it might be until next week that we can actually show you this year's bills, but it's coming. So what you are going to see in here is up to something like November 2020. And so, you know, bills like the health insurance, what else do you have there? These are typical stuff. The state compacts, those are more or less, you know, ways to have a relationship as if, you know, if the New Jersey were a country, then you have a, you know, sort of diplomatic relationship with New York, and, you know, they agree to have a compact to do certain things like a treaty or something. And there's a whole bunch of compacts that are out there. More or less, those are the special interest groups aren't really behind those things. It's more like just smoothing things so that, you know, things run smoothly between states for the most part. You know, things about mortgage here, physical therapy, things like that. So, you know, you can kind of go through and you can actually change the dates and change your and look into your states and see what you find. That's just one way of looking at these things. Well, let me just step back a little bit. So the difficulty in building these things, and it took us nearly 2 years, is that, as you can imagine, the bills out there that you can actually get a copy of, we actually use the Legiscan for those service. You know, they are typically in PDF, right? And so obviously we have to convert it into text. And each state obviously has different format for how the bill would look. You know, some certain states would have the headings and all that stuff, and you have the actual text. And on the merging on the left, you might have like a number for each line. That might be the format. And then at the end, you might have a page number and stuff like that. But if you actually convert everything into text, then those numbers showed up in the middle of the sentence, and you have to clean those things up. And our data team did what they could to really just smooth it out, but there's only so much they can do about it, since, you know, we have 50 different versions of those things. So we have to account for that. So let's say you have a text that is just carbon copy with each other. So one introduced in Tennessee, another introduced in Kentucky. It came from the same bill. It's exact copy and paste. But because of the formatting issues with those two different states, you might end up not having the actual 100% match, right? There's just no way that you can actually make that happen. So to account for it, we basically did scan the documents in certain word chunks. I can't quite remember exact number, maybe like up to 10 words at a time, and scan it. So take the first 10 words out of that one particular text and see if you can actually do the same thing with the other document and see, you know, if you find any match. Certain number of words happen to match, then we flag them as a match and just keep on going throughout the text. And you do that basically a million bills. so that's the way sort of we flagged it. Then at the end of the day, when you have two separate documents with certain percentage of documents flagged as match, then we'll basically put this in, flag this in this particular tracker. Can't quite remember off the top of my head what the actual threshold percentage was in terms of what you consider it to be a match. There was at one point of a debate of whether we should be able to move around those threshold for the people. So if you lower the threshold, then you would find way more matches. But if you make it near the 100, then obviously you would maybe find a couple, if at all. So we just wanted to get into the happy medium so you can actually find stuff. The problem with the happy medium is that you end up finding so-called matches that aren't really matches, unfortunately. So you have to be really careful about how to go about doing the searches. But in terms of what you want to do, let's say if you're looking in a case of that Tennessee example, if you have the bill number, then we can just plug that right in. Unfortunately, this is case sensitive for whatever reason. I happen to know the bill number of the bill number of that car dealership bill. It's right here, and it looks like this. So if you find a bill that you're interested in, you click on that, and then it gets you to this particular page, and it'll give you the URL for the Legiscan, and you can read the actual text in a PDF format or what have you. And down here, you would also see the other bills. There happen to be just only one bill that are identified as a match, but you can do this. So you select one of these things and you can actually compare them, and it takes you to this page. So this is this one right here is the Tennessee bill, and this is the Louisiana one. Now, if you want to actually compare them, you click on this thing here, then you would have two bills right next to each other. And we built the tracker so that you can actually see what are the matches, what's highlighted in here. So let's see. You see that similarities here? Stop sale order means notification issued by a manufacturer, blah, 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 right? So it's a very, very close match. And you would find chunk of language that are very, very similar. So, you can be pretty confident that this probably came from the same document one way or another. This one, my understanding is that this Louisiana bill actually isn't the bill that I'm talking about. It's very similar, but it actually doesn't have the disclosure clause in it. So it's actually not, the Louisiana bill isn't particularly bad, but there are other bills in other states that actually does have the disclosure. The reason they don't show up as a choice earlier was that they have different languages. Like Tennessee actually have a much more unique language in it than other bills that was developed out of the model bills.
We have 4 hands up, and we're kind of running low on time. So
yeah,
if we can go to, we have Stephen Caruso, then James, then Lisa, and then Laura, and it's 11:43. We can take this to like 11:55 and have a shorter break. So kind of keep the questions and answers somewhat discreet, so we can get all 4 in. So Stephen.
Hi, Stephen Caruso, Pennsylvania Capital Star. Just a quick question. You talked about ALEC. I also know there's 6, which is like usually more Democratic aligned model legislation. Just how would you compare the two groups? Because I've been seeing, I feel like 6 is lobbyist up in Harrisburg quite a bit lately.
I haven't paid attention to them past year or so, but they're way smaller than any of the conservative ones that you could find.
Okay.
So, you might be able to find what model bills actually they have developed, and you probably find that they probably don't have many. As opposed to ALEC on its own, they would have like hundreds already, and and ALEC is just one of the many on the right. So yeah, it's interesting. The Democrats, the people on the left, haven't used as much of this particular strategy, which is kind of interesting. That was another reason why I wrote that abortion piece.
Okay, James.
Yeah, just a really quick question, similar to Stella's, I think. But you mentioned, Louis, that you went through 100 bills reading through, which like mad respect for reading through 100 bills. But I guess my question is, outside of the like database, I mean, is there anything that would tip us off to, oh, this is model legislation, or are we just like, we're just running every bill that we're working on, we should be running through your database? Like, are there any indicators, any like telltale signs? I guess that's outside of reading like 100 bills. Like, what's a good sign?
Right. Well, I had to do the 100 bills reading just because our tracker wasn't quite up to snuff. But our tracker should be able to help you in most of what you're looking for. But in terms of the tip, so what basically happens is, again, the stereotypical example I gave at the very beginning of this conversation is somebody taking what they have been given and basically entirely copy and pasting, the complete plagiarism, legislative version of it. That happens, but that's only just one part of it. And most of the time, people would take very technical language that they wouldn't be able to come up with and just drop that particular paragraph into somewhere. And those technical things usually are stuff like the definitions section of the bills. If you are dealing with some kind of regulation, that comes relatively high up in a text usually. So in a case of the disclosure bill that I was talking about, there's a section called section that talks about do not drive order, which is something that you would get if you have serious recall safety issues. And the FTC, I think, or the agency, whichever the agency, I'm totally forgetting it now, they issue that stuff. And if you have one of those, then you're seriously in trouble. Those kind of things, they will define what they are, and so that when it comes time later in the section of the bill to talk about what they want to change, they would have the reasons to, well, they don't have to get into all the technical part of it. That's kind of how it's written usually. And those technical part of it is typically when you want to copy and paste if you are not particularly the technical person. So you might want to look through, and like if you want to go search some stuff in our tracker or even within the Legiscan, look for a certain phrase that sounds very technical, whatever, and you can look for that kind of a language, and then you might have a better idea. Then you might have better luck finding the copycats.
Okay, Lisa.
Hi, I had a question just to see kind of if this was on your radar. I came across some model legislation, I think, when I was reporting out a story about bills that were being filed. I'm from the Boston Herald in Massachusetts, sorry. And some bills that were being filed that would limit our governor's executive power under a state of emergency. And one of them had like, a 30-day sunset, trying to give courts more leverage to hear cases challenging this. And it was modeled off legislation from the Pacific Legal Foundation. And I was just curious if that had like come across your radar at all, like what I should be looking out for in tracking that bill coming, like going forward. I've heard that they've worked with a lot of different states to get pieces of their model bill into bill. So it sounds like sounds like that, but I'm just curious, what I should be looking for.
I'm not familiar with them. I haven't really seriously paying attention to this stuff full time for the past year or two since I was done with this particular project. So that's the reason I just haven't heard it. But it sounds like if they have like this many different states, you should be able to find. I'm sorry, what was that?
Well, I guess just is there anything that I should really be like looking out for if this bill really starts to make it, get some significant movement forward? Or
it's great.
Yeah, I'm not sure where that sound's coming from.
Yeah, well, anyway, so I guess it really depends on what it actually tries to do. But sometimes it's enough to just to flag the fact that this is something that's pushed by outside groups. That's a good thing to highlight in your story. But if it's easily known that this is something that the outside groups are already pushing, then what other agenda do they have? Like what kind of groups are they? So maybe just reporting beyond just the text of the actual bill, but like what are they up to and why are they pushing this stuff? More of a typical lobbying digging that you can do around that probably would be the next thing you probably could do.
Okay, we just got a couple more minutes, so we'll go to Laura Schulte next, and then try to get hers and Ethan's in.
Hi, my name's Laura. I'm a reporter with the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel in Wisconsin, and I'm working on a project right now where we're looking to see if we can find model legislation regarding clergy abuse. And I'm wondering, how far back do these databases go? Would we be able to find legislation, say, from like 2002 in here?
Well, yeah, well, our tracker can go all the way to 2010, but that's it. But if it's kind of a running strategy, and there's a whole bunch of bills that's been introduced since 2010, then at least you should be able to identify those ones first and see if you can actually, examine the exact wording and certain stuff. Then you can identify the very technical things that would pop up in every bill. And maybe you can just do the search on those particular terms using Google, which will be much more precise. Obviously, our tracker, for the reason I explained, doesn't quite let you do the exact matches. But you can use the Google to actually do the search on Legiscan or whatever. So that might be my suggestion, just to find what you can and just find the very technical language that always pop up in those things.
Okay, Ethan and Jill, we'll try to get yours. I'm not sure we will though, but Ethan next.
Hi, my name's Ethan. I'm a reporter in New Hampshire for the Concord Monitor. I just had a kind of a big picture question, I guess, which is when you find these model legislation matches, what was the tool that you thought was most helpful to try to track who's behind the legislation? I noticed that in your original investigation, you were able to kind of figure out which interest groups were actually at the origin. And other than kind of asking lawmakers or getting sources to tell you in individual states, was there anything that helped come from a meta perspective to try to track those down?
That's really tricky. That's something that you just have to do some digging with your reporting, unfortunately. But what's cool about finding different states introducing similar bills is that, in case you happen to be in certain states that are very, very not transparent, but if you have a similar bill that's pending in Florida, for example, or in New Jersey, and the lobbying disclosure statute is much stronger there, then you can find who's actually pushing for these things, or who actually had meeting over one certain bill with executives from the governor's office or the House Speaker. Then you can kind of figure out, okay, who's actually pushing for this stuff, and maybe you can start actually talking to people around those groups. So that's one tip I would have on that. So
we have two speakers with us from the National Conference on State Legislatures. The first is Mick Bullock, who is Director of Public Affairs for NCSL. He's in the DC office, and he's responsible for digital media, broadcasting, and media relations. Before that, he was Communications Director for Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant, and was on his communications team for Lieutenant Governor and State Auditor. Ben Williams is a policy specialist at NCSL and their elections and redistricting program. That includes tracking legislation, analyzing cases, and writing and convening meetings on the topic. I will note, before we actually get into the important substance of this talk, that Mick has the Mississippi State Capitol in his background. I would just like to remind everybody, I think we talked about this before, but the best looking Capitol in the country is the Iowa State House. So I just don't want anybody to forget that. West Virginia comes in pretty close. The Mississippi one is fine, Mick, but just remember Iowa wins, and it's just kind of the way it is. And with that, I will turn it over to Mick.
Well, Chris, thank you so much. And Jeff, if you'll go ahead and bring up my PowerPoint presentation, I appreciate that. Chris, I actually was asked that question in a talk one time. Well, what's your most favorite state capital out there? And I responded, it's like, they're all beautiful. They're all gorgeous state capitals. So while I am from Mississippi, I will have to say, out of all the state capitals I have visited, they are absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous institutions. First of all, I want to thank you for having me and kind of speak to you about the many services that the National Conference of State Legislatures provides. What I'm going to try to do is give you literally 1,000-foot overview. Please, ladies and gentlemen, know that I am not a policy person. So if you have any particular policy questions or anything such as that, I will be giving you an email address that goes to our press room, where we again disseminate those inquiries and such there. So, but let's go ahead and get started and tell you a little bit about NCSL if you do not know already. National Conference of State Legislatures, again, is a bipartisan organization. These are some of the things that, of course, that we provide our services for. So keep in mind, we're the only organization where we service all 7,300 state legislators out there, as well as the 27,000 legislative staff. And we do that, of course, through our policy research, our trainings, also our NCSL and DC office, which we'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes. And then also, I'm sure many of you know about our meetings that are held throughout the country. In fact, our legislative summit, which we're going to be making an announcement about soon. That again provides an opportunity for all the legislators and legislative staff to come together and talk about issues that are facing today. Next slide, please. Again, I think an important thing to kind of to better understand NCSL is also to understand kind of our makeup. NCSL, truthfully, works just like a state legislative institution, and basically, you can. By serving on our committee and such, you have to either be an elected member or a legislative staff member. And that's kind of our makeup right there. Next slide. This right here, again, Tim Story, many of you, if you've ever dealt with elections or anything, Tim Story is like the czar of elections and elections coverage, along with Wendy Underhill and Ben. Tim is now our executive director. He is an institution by itself. And then also Wisconsin Speaker Robin DeVos, our NCSL president. At NCSL, it rotates R to D each year. And then, of course, the staff chair, Martha Wigton, from the great state of Georgia. Next slide. And then these, of course, are some of our other officers. Speaker Psaki will be coming on and next and replacing the speaker from Wisconsin, Speaker Psaki there. Again, just kind of going through some of our leadership. Next slide. I like to show this real quick. NCSL, and I'm just going to be straight up honest with you. Yesterday, I logged in 72 media inquiries. We have a very, very robust operation. I honestly think we could hire somebody just for media relations, which is probably, it's a small part of my job, but we have a very robust operation. I think a lot of it has to do with the research that we have, and of course the bipartisan information that we're providing. But again, we're tracking more than 1,400 issue areas. I like to tell people a lot of times, if you can think of it, we're probably going to have information on it and how it's impacted states. Next slide. In the next slide right here, these are just some of the questions that we typically get from reporters. A lot of our stuff is, trend information, what's happening in other states. Have you seen this before? Here's a bill in Pennsylvania. Are you tracking legislation like this? What are you tracking on criminal justice reform, immigration, et cetera? Again, that is where our policy research team really comes into play. And to be honest with you, a lot of our policy research folks are located in our Denver, Colorado office, where again, a lot of them are working on the particular issues there. Next slide. First of all, let me say, I love reporters so much. I married one. And I just have to point this out and say, if you're ever wanting to know something, please check our website first. I would really, really appreciate that. I know that a lot of you, let me just call them on the phone or let me shoot them an email. But one quick thing, if you don't mind, is again, and go to the next slide, is just checking out that little Google search bar on our main webpage, ncsl.org. We have done a lot of work in the search terms that we're using. So again, if check that particular link out, check that out first before reaching out to us. We would really appreciate that. I would say out of the 70-something inquiries yesterday, I would say about 30 of them were answered by me just Googling on our website, and I found the information and sent it to them. So again, that's just a real helpful tool right there. Next one. This particular, what I'm going to try to do is take you through just a couple of the top bar icons that I personally think that are the most useful if you're ever trying to find information. And that right there, the research bar, when you toggle over that, again, just like legislative committees, that's how a lot of our topics and issue areas are divided. I would also point you out on the tools section, because the next slide is actually going to point a little bit or go a little bit more into that. On that tools part right there, this is actually the page with all of our databases. The top database, and if you'll go to the next slide, Access NCSL's 50 state bill tracking system. This particular page, this is by issue area. This is a page or databases that are free to access. So you do not have to be a legislator or legislative staff member to access this particular page. These databases are updated literally daily and weekly and monthly. Sometimes a lot of reporters will reach out to me and they'll say, well, the timestamp on the right-hand bar says, February 10th, 2020, is this the most up-to-date information? 9 times out of 10, yes, it is the most up-to-date information. It's just that particular timestamp was not changed manually. So again, this is a very, very valuable resource, and that I point a lot of reporters to is this particular research page. So check that out. Next slide. On this one, sometimes reporters will ask me, hey, where can I, get some, information on what's happening in state legislatures? So I love to point you to our news section right there. And when you again toggle over that, there's actually a couple places. Number one is blogs. We have anywhere between 5 and 10 different blogs coming out daily. A lot of them, again, are trends that's happening out there that our policy team is looking at. You can also check out a number of our e-newsletters from a lot of our different topic areas. Legis briefs are really, really good. Those are, again, think of them as a deep dive in a particular issue area. Press room, of course, is just what it is, press releases and such. Podcast. Again, our podcasts come out the first, second, and third Mondays of every month. If you have not subscribed to Our American Democracy, we would love for you to sign up for our podcast. We're actually going to be revamping our podcast series beginning in July, so we're really excited about that. And then the last link there, the state legislatures news. If you're familiar with NCSL, NCSL had kind of an iconic magazine called State Legislatures Magazine. We actually have just revamped that, and we're just now calling it State Legislatures News. It's more so online, so that way when new things are happening, we're writing stories about it as it's happening. So that's really a great resource. Check that out, State Legislatures News. Next slide. This again, we continue to offer over 100+ conferences and meetings throughout the country. Of course, during COVID, unfortunately, a lot of these meetings and things have been held online or in a virtual world. So again, when you go to the icon there where it says meetings and training, I know that we had, and Ben can attest to this, we had a number of redistricting meetings throughout the country. We've had criminal justice reform, we've had immigration, but again, all of our meetings are located right there. And I will say this though, at NCSL considers any meeting that is a NCSL branded meeting as open to the media. And again, that is something I am very proud for. I've been working at NCSL now for 7 years, and that is a policy I hold very dearly. And I'm very proud of to work for an organization that has that type of stance. I would also say that whenever you see or hear about one of our meetings and you reach out to me, I'll take our legislative summit, for example. You know, a registration for an NCSL summit is about $800. For the media, and again, what I'm looking for is, you know, registered members of the media. We actually will provide that registration for free. So again, we verify you are who you are. And then I would also say we try to limit it to 2 people from any entity. So if you're from, let's say, ABC News or whatever, we're going to give you 2 passes or 2 free passes. Any more than that, again, you're able to register for NCSL. You just have to pay the registration fee. Next slide.
Mick, can I ask one question?
Yep.
What about, I mean, we have several people on the call from the USA Today network. I mean, they're either with USA Today or they're with one of the USA Today newspapers. They've got Kanaya House newspapers. How do you treat newspaper chains or other, you know, organizations with multiple outlets?
I think on those cases, it's a case-by-case scenario, you know, because we've had that before where like our last in-person meeting in Nashville, you know, we had, I'm trying to think, it was CNN that came, and but you had 2 crews that were wanting to cover the criminal justice portion, and then the other wanted to cover something else, and we worked between that, you know. So yeah, I think on those types of situations, it's a case by case, and we're happy to work with you. The more information you provide to us, the better we can help you, you know, and leveraging through that.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. The other thing, the other icon is where it says NCSL and DC. So a unique part about NCSL, and then of course your next speaker, the National Governors Association. We are considered by the federal government as an instrument of the states. So we're, you know, I guess you could say we're quasi-government, but we're also advocating on behalf of the states, and that's what our DC office does. So if you're ever working on a story that has kind of a federal component to it, healthcare, for example, I'll use the new funding legislation that of course came out. Our team in DC is diving into that. They're actually meeting with the Department of Treasury today and getting some guidance on that new piece of legislation. So again, that's what our federal office does, and then of course packages that information and informs our membership of what these particular things mean for the states. Next slide. And then also a little bit further about NCSL and DC. A lot of times members of the media will call me and say, "Oh, do we have a statement on this, or do we have a position on this?" Again, just like a legislative process, it goes through an actual process. That is part of our when we have the annual summit, we actually have a convening of the states, if you please, that actually vote on policy and that gives directives and everything for the NCSL and DC office to work on the behalf in DC. And again, these are just some of our different committees or standing committees that we have at NCSL. Next slide. Yeah, meet 2 times a year. Committees develop policy directives and such. And again, it's that's a picture right there, I think, from our last meeting. It's almost like going to a national Republican or Democrat national convention. You set legislators and legislative staff set with their particular state there and vote on policy directives that's coming, that's being given to the DC office. It's a pretty cool operation if you've never seen that in person. Next slide. And then, of course, another place that I direct a lot of people to also, if you do not currently follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn, please do, especially Twitter. Twitter is probably one of our most widely used social media apps, especially by the media. So we highly advise you to check us out there. Instagram, of course, is more of a graphic driven there. And then, of course, we post a lot of media articles and things that our staff are mentioned in on LinkedIn. So anytime you're ever working on an article and you do talk to one of my colleagues, we'll be happy to tag you and everything and make sure that you get the proper recognition on your side too. We love to share the love, if you please. Next slide. This is, again, my email address. Yes, I have a personal email address, but I always like to point people to the press room at ncsl.org. In my role at NCSL, I travel a lot. And that's the reason I like to funnel all media inquiries to the press room at press-room at ncsl.org. Let me give it just a few little caveats here real quick. Is that, again, we do receive a number of inquiries. We try to be very responsive to your inquiries. We know that you are under deadlines a lot of times. NCSL is a unique organization in that basically we take that inquiry, and that's the reason I love email the best, because we're able to package that and send that to directly to the policy person, and we're actually able to get you 9 times out of 10 a quicker response to your question because we have the information up front. So again, take that email address down. If you have any inquiries coming up, or if you have any questions that's not been covered in this presentation, be happy to kind of get to you there. In the next part of this presentation, I want to go ahead and introduce Ben Williams, one of my colleagues from out in the Denver, Colorado office. Ben, the reason I wanted to bring Ben on is because, good gracious, redistricting, the census, all of that, it is something that is not going away. Any given time, we're receiving several inquiries a day. And so I want to thank Ben and Wendy and the elections team for being so responsive to media inquiries on that. So Ben, I want to go ahead and bring you on. And again, there's the elections email address right there. Ben, take it away.
Thank you, Mick. And hello, everybody. Happy to be here. As Mick mentioned earlier, the policy team tends to be in Denver. I am located in Denver. And so you'll have to forgive me if I reach over here for my enormous jug of coffee. It's still mid-morning here. So I'm you know, in the middle of caffeinating. So the things I wanted to share with you in terms of redistricting, we have a couple of different kinds of resources. One of the ones that'll probably be most useful to you because it's searchable are our web pages. And we have a lot of different ones. They tend to be subdivided into subcategories related to redistricting. And instead of showing you my screen, I'm just going to pop these in the chat, and then you all can copy those over and bookmark them if you're interested. And then I'll just walk through them each individually pretty quickly. So the first one is our Redistricting Starter Kit. And it's sort of the beginner. You've never looked at redistricting before, and you need to understand a mile wide and an inch deep, everything about the process. And it was designed for legislative staffers. That was the intended audience, but it has some cross applicability to different groups as well. And I would imagine that press would be the same. So if you just needed a quick answer on anything about when is redistricting, why does it happen? What kinds of data are used? What is public input? What are the legal requirements? Why is there so much litigation? You'll find quick and easy answers to all of those on here. I would say, and Mick may agree with me, one of the questions that we get a lot, maybe not in this exact moment, but for 9 of the 10 years in a decade, is about redistricting commissions. That tends to be one of the hot topics. That's usually something that's driven by litigation, that the narrative around commissions. So here are our two, that's the, sorry, I copied the wrong one. We have 2 different pages, one for redistricting commissions for Congress and one for redistricting commissions for legislative districts. And they do differ. Some states have a commission for one type of district, but not another. So we've separated those into 2 separate web pages. And you just scroll through, it'll have information on how many commissioners are on the commission, how is it structured, are there any unique rules for how it votes? That would be something that you could look at. And then we also have a web page on the rules for redistricting. What kind of rules does your state have to abide by when it's drawing a map? Does the district have to be compact in a particular area? Do districts all have to be connected to one another? Do they have to be contiguous? Is there a requirement in the law that the state consider communities of interest when drawing districts? We have information on redistricting criteria for all 50 states as well. The thing that you probably are wondering the most about now, though, is the census, which is very tied in with redistricting. My colleagues and I have been doing a lot of census work recently. And so we have a couple of things that may be helpful to you. The first one is our webpage on the census delays and the impact that that can have on redistricting. We've sort of categorized states with legal deadlines into specific types of buckets for how the delays at the Census Bureau will impact that state's legal deadline. We also have a webpage on just what the deadlines are if you just needed a citation. We have all of that here as well. And then one of the things that may be coming up in your state, may not, I don't know, but is whether or not a state is required to use data from the Census Bureau to redistrict, or if the state is permitted to use alternative types of data. We have a webpage on that as well. One other thing, we have a webpage that just gives us a general overview of the redistricting system of all 50 states. If you've ever looked at some of the other websites that do this, like All About Redistricting, Justin Levitt's website at Loyola Law School, I'm sure some of you have seen that resource before. This is somewhat similar. Justin Levitt is a good friend of NCSL, and we've worked with him frequently. In fact, if you look at some of the links that are on the page I'm about to send you, they actually redirect you to like court filings that he's uploaded. But this is a really good resource for getting a very brief overview of how a redistricting system works in states. And I just updated this yesterday, so I can confirm to you this webpage is as up to date as it gets. So the last thing is, Mick mentioned that in addition to these resources, there's usually already a resource that exists that has the answer for you. I don't think Mick can think of a better resource that would have any answer for you on anything redistricting than our Redistricting Law Book, which is a, oh, I've got it right here. It's a 200 and something page book on all things redistricting. It's absolutely enormous. And if you have a question about anything redistricting at all, odds are it's in this book. And if you're interested in getting a copy, send an email to elections-info@ncsl.org. Typically we do charge for these, but since you're press, we'll comp it. So we can get you one of these. And I can tell you that having worked with journalists who have covered redistricting in past decades, they like to pull it out if I'm on doing a video call with them and like, I still got it. I'm like, that's great. I'm glad that it's been useful to you so much that 10 years later, it's still sitting on your desk.
Ben, what's the email again?
Elections-info. I'll just put it in the chat.
Okay.
At ncsl.org. That's our general election sort of email address. And if there's something that comes in about like this sort of thing, like if it's a press inquiry, send it to Mick. But if it's something like, I want a red book, like Mick doesn't need to see that email. You just send it to us and we'll process that for you. The other things that may be helpful to you as you're covering redistricting, because it's such a fast moving subject area. I mean, already we have the 3 lawsuits, and we're only into March, about this cycle's redistricting. We have a lawsuit in Ohio, we have a lawsuit in Minnesota, and we have a lawsuit in Alabama. We like to send frequent updates to our redistricting distribution list. That's an informal listserv that we maintain as the elections and redistricting team at NCSL. Again, if you want to be on that and you're not on it already, just send an email to elections-info and say, hey, I'm blah, I'm with this press outlet, I'd like to be on the distribution list, and we'll get you on that. Typically, we send maybe 1 or 2 emails a week. I will tell you that recently it's been more than that because there's just a lot going on. But if you need like the most up-to-date information about census and redistricting, we will disseminate the latest through that listserv. Mick mentioned the magazine and the blog. We do write magazine articles and blogs as well, so that's another place to follow if you want the latest on a particular subject. For example, I may be working on a bill or a blog about a bill that just passed in the New Mexico Legislature, creating an advisory commission in that state. So you can get something on that. The next thing is we have calls once every month, maybe once every 5 or 6 weeks with Census Bureau staffers and people in the states to talk about the census and the impact that the delays are having on redistricting. And those are called our census update calls. They tend to be well attended. We usually have 200 or 300 people on those calls, including several journalists. I know that Hansi-Lo Wong at NPR was writing news articles because we broke news from the Census Bureau on one of those calls earlier this year. So that is a place where things happen. And I think the next one is coming up in mid-April. So if you go onto that little Google search thing that Mick showed you and just look up census updates on the NCSL website, you'll get the latest information and the link to register there. And then the last thing is Mick mentioned that the meetings have been largely suspended because of COVID-19. I will tell you that the redistricting program is planning on having a redistricting seminar, another in-person meeting, sometime in August. We're thinking the second weekend of August. We're still trying to finalize details on that. We don't know the exact location or the exact dates yet, but that's another one of those meetings that press will be allowed to attend for free if you go through the process that Mick described earlier. So if you want to learn more about it in person, obviously you have to get to wherever it is, and I don't know where it's going to be yet. That's not my decision. Our meetings team makes that choice, but that's an excellent place to get a quick 48-hour, 72-hour primer on everything you need to know about redistricting. And as always, we're a resource. We're happy to talk to journalists. I was on the phone with a journalist right before I hopped on this call. So if there's anything that we can do to help, just reach out to Mick, and then he'll pass it to the correct member of my team who can answer your question. And this is a complicated beat, so best of luck covering it over the next couple of years. You're going to need a lot more coffee than I have in this cup.
So we have time for just a quick question or two. Our two speakers from the NGA are here in the room, but does anybody have a quick question or two? I mean, it's a great resource, and these guys are both very accessible. So I'm sure if you reached out to them after this meeting. All right. And so a nice shout out from you for you. So anything else, Mick?
I don't think so, Chris. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk about the many services and things that we provide at NCSL. Look forward to working with all of you. Again, I put the press room email address there in the chat box. Please reach out to us. We'll be glad to add you to our media list if you're not a part of that already. Also, we'll be sending out a media alert and everything once we know more about the redistricting meeting, as well as the NCSL Legislative Summit. So yeah, thanks so much, Chris. Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, all right, and all the links that they both gave us, we will be providing all the. I've collected all those, and we'll provide a full list of those to the fellows. So Mick and Ben, thank you very much. And we're just going to go immediately into our next session. It's going to be another quick, short session. We have two folks from the National Governors Association here that talk about the Center for Best Practices. It's 12:30 right now, and we just have them until the end of our program day today at 1. But I want to introduce Timothy Blute, who is the director of the Center for Best Practices at the National Governors Association. He leads a team of policy experts who identify, research, and disseminate the best practices in state public policy. Brittany Roy serves as a program director for public health in the Center for Best Practices. She manages a public health portfolio in dealing with infectious diseases, supporting health equity, reducing health disparities for at-risk populations, and other issues. So Timothy and Brittany, thank you very much for joining us. And so I will turn it over to you.
Hey, thanks, Chris, and good to be with you all today. I wish we could all be in person, but I guess we're all getting used to our Zoom squares. This is my second time with this group. I was with you all, I think, a previous class. I guess that was the fall of 2019. Does that sound right, Chris?
Yeah, right. November, December of 19.
Okay, and obviously quite a bit has changed. So really enjoy being with you today. I'm also, as Chris mentioned, joined by my colleague Brittany, who leads our public health portfolio, as well as our communications director, Eric Wolschlegel, is on the line as well today. So I thought I'd open up, talk a little bit about NGA and our Center for Best Practices and what we do, and then talk a little bit about how we've supported governors over the last year in their pandemic response, and then a couple of the issue areas that we see going forward. And I want to leave time to answer any of the questions that you all may have. So I've been with NGA for 7 years, started out working and leading our cybersecurity practice and portfolio within the Center for Best Practices, and now have been the director of the Center for Best Practices for about 1.5 years. And so I have the good fortune of leading a team of about 45 policy experts. As Chris mentioned, we're the state-facing side of NGA. So NGA essentially has 2 core functions. One is advocating on behalf of the governors to the executive branch and the legislative branch. And so that's our government relations team. And then I lead sort of the other side of NGA. And our work is all state-focused. So we are not advocating here in Washington to the federal government. We're helping governors identify and implement policy best practices. And we really help them across the full suite of policy issues that they work on. So we're divided up into 14 distinct policy teams. I won't sort of bore you by walking through each of the 14, but suffice to say, we cover everything from healthcare to public health, education, that's early childhood, all the way through post-secondary, infrastructure, economic policy and workforce, homeland security, energy, cybersecurity, and public safety. And what that means in practice is that on any given day, we're working very closely with the governor's relevant policy advisors in that space, hearing from them what are their policy challenges that they're working on, where do they need assistance, what research can we provide, how can we connect them with outside experts, and then in some cases working with them on longer term, more in-depth, what we would call technical assistance engagement. So we may have a governor's office that's really thinking, how can I improve my public health preparedness, as an example, right? A timely topic. And so we would work with a group of states over the course of 1 year or more, really going to that state in a non-pandemic year, multiple times, doing strategic planning exercises with them, and really helping them improve, and in some cases implement their policy priorities. I should back up. I realize I jumped right into the center, just the actual organization. Let me start there real quick. So we are the bipartisan voice of the nation's governors. All 55 state and territorial governors are our members, and we work as sort of, we work on their behalf. Our policy priorities are derived from them, and we represent them. So we are the only bipartisan organization of the nation's governors, and have been doing so since 1908. So sorry, with that intro, I thought I could start by just talking a little bit about the last year, in particular, our work on the COVID pandemic. So like everybody, starting about 13 months ago, our world was dominated by the pandemic. So we stood up an internal working group that started out with about 8 people, and within a couple of weeks became almost 100% of our organization, focused on providing governors the resources and information they needed to combat the pandemic. So last spring, initially that meant educating governors and their advisors on the scope of the pandemic, updating them on the outbreak, providing them with information as we were learning it about the actual outbreak itself. And then that additionally morphed into all the issues that we all recall from the front pages a year ago. So how do you find, deploy, distribute PPE to the people that need it? How do you ramp up testing capabilities across the country? We helped governors and their staff navigate sort of a myriad number of relatively novel legal issues, or at least legal issues that had not been litigated since the 1918 flu epidemic. So questions around quarantine law, stay-at-home orders, essential business designations. And then in the early spring, if you remember sort of the optimism of last May, helping governors and state officials think about those early reopening strategies, transitioning out of those initial stay-at-home orders. Over the course of the summer, we started to ramp up work and planning around vaccination distribution. I think we all were sort of optimistically hoping for the vaccination scenario we find ourselves in, but we began that work in the August and September timeframe, really helping to understand traditional immunization distribution channels, immunization planning, and begin to help governors think through what vaccine distribution at this scale would look like. We also began in the summertime to help those governors that were beginning to contemplate school reopening, think about strategies for effectively and safely reopening schools. And that work has obviously continued onward. As I think about sort of all the work that we've done over the last year on COVID, should note just about everything we've produced is on our website. So we put out about 80 different policy memos and resources that are up on our website. Our website's a great resource for our COVID work as well as non-COVID work that we do. But if you go take a look at that at some point, that can give you a good sense of the topics we've covered within the pandemic response and then more broadly. And obviously going forward, my colleague Eric would be happy to connect you with any of the policy experts who you see on that site if there's anything you're interested in learning more about. If I think about our current work, not surprisingly, the bulk of our time is still spent on COVID response, in particular vaccinations. So helping governors promote increased vaccine and vaccination distribution, promoting equitable vaccine availability, talking about how we can communicate vaccine safety and efficacy, addressing vaccine hesitancy, especially as we rapidly reach a point at which supply likely outstrips demand. How do we reach those communities that are reluctant to get the vaccine? Continue to do a lot of work around school reopening, and then planning for the sort of medium and longer term education issues that follow from that. So social and emotional learning considerations from students who've been out of the classroom or in a hybrid environment. And then as we think longer term, what are some of the learning loss issues that we're going to have to deal with given the vast disruption to the schools and to the school systems? And then one of the other items we've been talking a lot about is, and Brittany and I have been doing a lot of sort of introductory work in this space. What are the sort of, when we get past the point, hopefully in the springtime or in the early summer of a large cohort of Americans being vaccinated, what's sort of the tail of the COVID pandemic? So how do governors think about setting up surveillance testing? How do you think about managing and mitigating outbreaks that we know are going to pop up as this pandemic hopefully transitions into more of a routine stage and less of a crisis pandemic? That's one of our sort of emerging pandemic issues we're working on. And then I also want to mention just some of the non-COVID work that we're doing. I think over the course of the last year, it's sort of been a gradual dial from 100% COVID back to increasing more and more non-peer COVID work. Although we find in many of the states we work in, all the work is sort of COVID adjacent because that still remains the dominant issue. So not surprisingly, one of our top issues is economic recovery and workforce recovery. I think the economic outlook for the country and for a lot of the states certainly is more positive than what we thought it would have been 6 or 8 or 9 months ago, but there still remains a great deal of work to be done on helping governors with their economic recovery agendas, in particular their workforce recovery agendas. Second major topic for us, again, probably not shocking, is infrastructure. With a particular focus on broadband infrastructure as well. So we've got a whole infrastructure team at NGA that supports governors, transportation advisors, energy advisors, and broadband advisors as they think about how to rebuild, repair, and build out America's infrastructure. A third priority area for us, which actually has quite predates the pandemic by nearly a decade, is a pretty steady work stream on opioid abuse and broader substance abuse questions. Unfortunately, after many years of progress, we saw in 2020 a significant increase in overdose deaths, And so that work continues, and we've got a team that is jointly led by our health team and our public safety team that address opioid and substance abuse. And then the last priority I would mention is our work on cybersecurity, in particular with the incredible movement towards remote work and including remote work at the state level. I think you've seen a lot more reliance on public sector information technology systems. And with that, we've seen obviously the vulnerability that can come along with that. And so we've got a team that works across the country with states, helping them address and promote increased and improved cybersecurity practice. And so those are just a handful of our priorities. On any given day, our team is sort of typically doing three things. One, engaging a group of states on a defined project. Two, conducting research and addressing ad hoc requests for assistance from governors. So last year, as an example, we got somewhere over about 700 discrete research requests from governors' offices asking for assistance on something that could end up being, a significant research project, or just as simple as connecting a governor's office with an expert in the space that we're aware of. And then lastly, a big piece of what we do is that convening power. So bringing together various governors' policy advisors. And I think one of the biggest strengths that we can bring to governors and to state officials when they're trying to solve a policy problem is helping with the sort of cross-sector pollination. So we really strive to not view things through simply an education pipeline or a health silo or an economic development silo, but really offer them a cross-sector approach and a cross-sector solution to addressing their problems. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions or comments. I just wanted to provide kind of a broad overview. And as I mentioned, I could talk about any of the items I discussed here, and my colleague Brittany, if we have any specific public health portfolio questions, we're happy to take them, and also happy to be a resource to all of you, certainly going forward.
So Stephen Caruso.
Hi, my name is Stephen Cruz. I'm with the Pennsylvania Capital Star. I'm just curious. Also, you mentioned working with the pandemic and legalese. Also, has the NGA had to work with governors on talking about executive power? How many efforts have you documented? Are you documenting on efforts by legislatures to pin back executive power, take back power for legislatures? Is that something you've been dealing with from the past year as well?
Yeah, thanks for raising that. It's an issue we are tracking very, very closely. It started out, obviously, in the spring, helping governors think through the exercise of their existing executive power. But now, as you point out, we're seeing certainly disagreements in a number of states between the branches of government around that power going forward. And so, yeah, we've been documenting both the discussions within the legislative branch, as well as a number of the cases that have flowed through the judicial branch. So within our public safety team, we actually have a team of attorneys who have been tracking that work and have put out assistance to governors' legal counsel in the form of legal policy memos to help them navigate that. And I don't think we have anything up on our website specifically on that topic, but we are working on things right now that I think should be out probably a little later in the spring, taking a look at sort of the landscape of that discussion.
And I'm just curious to follow up. Are there we kind of talked about model legislation earlier in this. So maybe not necessarily model legislation, but if you had to put some of these efforts to take executive power away in buckets, could you kind of is there any sort of buckets that you're seeing more of, or specific sort of efforts that you're seeing more of than others?
Yeah, so I'm just think through that. I would say the general tenor that we're seeing is the legislature trying to exercise or trying to insert itself into the approval process, right? So I think what we've seen throughout the pandemic is the governor takes an executive action, and then the legislature tries to come back and take away that action or alter that. What we're seeing is kind of right now is going forward, the legislature trying to say, in some states saying, for the next time the governor attempts to exert this authority, they have to come to us for proactive approval. I think that's what we saw in the bill in Ohio that made news yesterday, and that's certainly one of the buckets. But I'm happy to dig more into that, and we can always follow up if you want to talk to our team on that.
Okay, Stacy.
Hey, my name is Stacy Barchinger. I'm a reporter for the Bergen Record and the Gannett papers in New Jersey. I'm sort of curious, you talked about, how the NGA makes or gives governors information about policy best practices. How do you handle partisanship in that? I mean, you have Democratic governors who are very progressive and some who are very conservative Republicans. So I'm just curious how you navigate that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, let me start by saying the Bergen Record is my hometown paper. So great to meet you virtually. You guys do great work. And my dad is an avid reader every morning, still up in New Jersey. It's a good question. So we do have, so the way we approach it is we sort of think of it from a just the facts approach, right? We provide, when the governor's offices come to us with a common problem, we'll provide them a range of information, and then they can choose what of that they can and want to implement in their states, right? And frequently, right, partisanship may be a concern, but sometimes there's demographic or geographic or economic considerations that are at play in addition to partisanship. And so we really try not to trying to get into the weeds on sort of the battle that's happening within the state, rather saying these are a range of policies that you should consider implementing to solve the problem. Pick from this range what works for your state. And then occasionally a state will follow up and say, okay, we're going to do, A and B, thinking about doing C, help us on that implementation and help us navigate that. We also have the good fortune that more often than not, I think our members view us as their bipartisan research organization. So they tend to come to us with issues that are more bipartisan in nature, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. And please tell your dad thank you for subscribing.
Will do.
Ethan.
Hi there, I'm Ethan DeWitt, reporter at the Concord Monitor in New Hampshire. I have a specific question about vaccines. Our governor has, he made some comments yesterday. He was asked about people who want access to the vaccines who don't have ID or driver's licenses to demonstrate that they're from New Hampshire. That would apply to the undocumented population, but also to students who are kind of studying. And he was very unequivocal, saying that if you don't have a New Hampshire ID, you should go back to whatever state you do have an ID in. He didn't comment on if you don't have an ID at all. So I guess I'm wondering if you're seeing that when you devise your best practices for states. Is that something you're seeing in other states? And when it comes to, increasing vaccination, is that a problem that you're identifying with actually access to the vaccine?
Yeah, great question, Ethan. So that was an issue. That came up probably with more frequency for us earlier on in the stages of the vaccination campaign when supply was incredibly constrained. I know there's a lot of discussion initially around folks from northern states who spent their winters in Arizona or New Mexico or Florida. But I'd have to go back and check with the team. I'm happy to follow up with you if we're seeing that writ large. We're tracking a lot of we're mainly tracking in the sort of state-by-state vaccine comparison, the phases that states are in and how they're timing out their phases, but I can go back and check particular around the ID piece, because I know it is state-by-state, and I know some states have changed their policy or altered the strictness as supply has opened up gradually.
Thanks.
And real quick, I know there's a bunch of comments in the chat. What I will do is I will drop our communication director, or Eric, you're on here. If you want to drop your email in the chat for follow-ups, if you guys have any questions that you want to follow up, you can work straight through Eric and we can set up those follow-ups, because I know there were quite a few questions around executive versus legislative powers.
All right. I have a question for Brittany on COVID response. Tim talked about how the NGA started preparing for the vaccine rollout, back last July or August. And now I'm wondering what you guys are looking forward to. What's next? What's your long-term planning? What should states be starting to plan for right now, and what should reporters be starting to look to cover right now?
Thank you for that question. I would say we are still in the temperature taking phase. So working with states very closely to figure out what their long-term and future needs are, and trying to help them think about how they leverage the lessons learned from this pandemic and how they can take those lessons learned and better prepare for the future. So that is something that we're constantly working on, not just with states, but other stakeholders in the field, to help our states really think about that long-term strategic goal.
And I would add one item to that, if that's okay, Chris. I think one of the other topics that we've talked quite a bit about in both our public health as well as in our homeland security portfolio, because in state government, obviously the health response has largely been driven by the health departments, but there's been a huge emergency management and coordination function that's often driven by state emergency management and homeland security departments. Is how are we going to rebuild a lot of these institutions that have been so stressed and tapped over the last year? How do we take not just the lessons learned and apply them to future pandemic preparedness, but how are the response entities in the state going to be ready for whatever just maybe even somewhat mundane challenges that come immediately after the pandemic? Because we know that a lot of these folks have been working around the clock for a year now. And then if we add the states that have seen concurrent emergencies in the form of natural disasters on top of a pandemic, there's been a lot of stress on these departments. And so how do we make sure that they're well prepared for just the immediate post-pandemic aftermath?
Okay. So Lisa, I saw a question in the chat for you. Was that one that you want to ask, or is that just, were you asking that of Tim or asking that of?
Yeah, no, he had mentioned that that if we wanted to follow up, I was just asking what the best way, as he's now addressed, was to follow up,
Okay.
to dig further into that issue. Yeah.
All right. Okay, Sam.
Hi, I'm Sam Metz. I'm from the Associated Press in Nevada. I was just wondering how you think the SolarWinds hack was covered on a state level, and if you think there's anything that reporters should be doing to continue covering that story.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I'm somewhat biased in that from my cyber days, I still feel like I still follow a lot of the cyber, like the state cyber publications, some of the like public sector IT reporters. And so I feel like it was covered reasonably well. I think the piece that my colleague who handles cybersecurity and I have chatted about a couple times is just that sometimes, it takes a long time to fully understand the scope of these cyber attacks and sort of I feel like we're still thinking about some of the longer term impacts of the OPM hack, right? And that was in 2012 or 2013, that we're almost becoming numb to the numbers, right? It's like, okay, another 30,000 servers were hacked. What does that mean to the average citizen? And so I think maybe that's kind of the piece that is missing from the discussion. It's just like the so what for the average citizen. When it's a ransomware attack against a school or against a hospital, it's like, okay, I get that immediately, but what are the actual real impacts on the functioning of government because of these hacks? Does that help answer the question, Sam?
Yeah, I think so. Do you think there's any information on that we should be requesting from, any state agency? That all of ours fall under the governor here. So that's kind of the context in which I'm asking.
Okay. Let me think. Let me follow up with you, or have our cyber person follow up directly with you who's on that. I think it's a great question.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, Stacy again.
Yeah, sorry, I just thought of another question on the cybersecurity topic. If states have like publicly held systems that are victims of cyber attacks, do they have to report that to anyone? And if so, whom?
Oof. The answer is going to be different in each state. Some states, the legislature is going to require, if you sort of do a survey of the state data breach notification laws, which it's been many years since I've done that, but I remember that in some states, the data breach notification law specifically covered public sector IT, that they have to publicly notify entities about the breach that occurred. Obviously, there's a lot in that definition of the word breach. And then I suspect that if the IT system connects with certain federal systems, you would have to report as well. But I think the most likely reporting requirements would be under the state data breach notification laws.
Okay, well, we have Jill.
Just a quick question regarding redistricting and kind of like executive powers there. Are you hearing from a lot of states about, or especially states that I guess have to use census data to redistrict, about concerns that they might have to push primaries back, or like how are they, like, is that something that the governor would have to make an executive order on, or is that something that like they would have to come to a consensus with the legislature on?
Yeah, important question, Jill, but actually not one that we do not engage much at all on election administration matters. We've done pre-pandemic, we did a couple early briefings for governor's staff on the census and what the process would look like, but we tend to not engage much, nor do we get a lot of questions on election administration. So I don't have much for you there.